Remember when? Remember how it was in Jacksonville in the days before World War II and after? Can you remember how it was yesterday? When today's golden oldies were the songs we sang, when today's classics were new books hot off the press, and the movies we watched were mostly in black and white. Maybe you can't remember when Jacksonville looked like this, but it was only yesterday. Did we ever think it would all pass away? And indeed, has Jacksonville and its beaches really changed that much? In some ways, yes. In others, no. There are strands of reality, sights and sounds that weave in and out of our yesterdays and our todays, the things that shape our city's character. They may look different now than they did yesterday, and some of them may not be here anymore. But there are those things, tried and true, that we will have with us always. Yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Our river, our bridges, our waterfront, and things like our old railroad station and the Gator Bowl. Things that are always with us, but forever changing, often for the better, although they never seem as good today as they do in our yesterdays. Mayor John Alsap was a cousin of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and one of Jacksonville's most dynamic mayors, serving during World War II. And by the way, we named the Main Street Bridge after him when it opened on July 4th, 1941. Few of us probably remember Chick Acosta personally, the man who single-handedly ramrodded the building of our first pedestrian bridge over the St. Johns River in 1926.
Mr. Acosta, as I say, was a very ambitious man that really worked, obviously, for the good of the city and his electors. He worked hard for the zoo. He was in charge of the zoo for years. And he was a real driver in the efforts to get the St. John's River Bridge for traffic and real development, which naturally followed very, very rapidly.
That bridge was the pride and joy of Jacksonville only yesterday.
It was a gala day for people in Jacksonville. We, of course, didn't have many cars at that time. In fact, my family didn't have a car. But from then on, people enjoyed going back and forth to Jacksonville to do their shopping and to go to the theaters, to meet their friends downtown, and to go to the various activities that were taking place.
Today's Skyway Express follows a long line of public transit ventures that began with the old river ferries that date back to Old Calford. Remember that name?
Going across the ferry was fun. We bought little tickets, so many for weeks, each student who went across the ferry. We met our friends at the ferry. We went across on the ferry going to Jacksonville. Many last-minute bits of homework were done. I think it took us about 7.5 minutes to get across. And I had one friend who never could finish her homework, either because she didn't want to or wanted me to help her. And I was always helping her finish her homework going across the water. It was lots of fun.
How many of us remember fondly the old streetcars that were once the pride of Jacksonville, Florida?
Well, the streetcars are one of the oldest memories that I have, because we lived, in my youngest days that I remember, we lived right at the corner of 2nd and Main Street, and the streetcars ran down a parkway right in the middle of Main Street. It was a double roadway on each side of a little park, and the streetcars were in the park. And the end of the line was 12th and Main Street of most of the lines. They did have a line that ran out to Panama Park, and then they ran in other directions all over town, all over Riverside, Lackawanna, Edison Avenue, Fairfield. They had a good streetcar system. It's too bad it's all gone now.
The streetcars were something that would be wonderful to have today. Surface transportation, I think, has got to come back, because the streetcar was dependable, and it could run a schedule. It did run a good schedule, and you could depend on getting somewhere. And the air pollution and the wrecks very seldom occurred with a streetcar and a vehicle.
It was something we didn't get to do too often. And the streetcars didn't go very far, you know. But going on the streetcar was a treat, going to the end of the line, as we called it, and to come back.
Well, I went to school to Andrew Jackson on the trolley car. You had to transfer. I lived in the east side, and I had to go up to Main Street and transfer to Main Street trolley that went north to Andrew Jackson High School.
When I was about 5 or 6, my mother would put my little straw hat on, me, and my little white gloves, and I'd get on the streetcar, go down to Cohen's, get a spool of thread, and go home. We couldn't do that today. There's no way you could put a little 5-year-old girl on a bus or a streetcar today. But all of us did that, and we all rode the streetcars.
I was with my grandmother. My grandmother never felt like she had conducted her business if she hadn't gone face to face. So when she wanted to pay bills, we went downtown on the streetcar. And we roamed around town, paid the bills, first here, first there, and somewhere else. And then it was time to come home. We'd ride the streetcar. The streetcar came up and down Main Street. There was a car that would make the right-hand turn and go east on 1st Street. How far that went, I don't know. But there was a car that came in and out there.
They came in all shapes and sizes, and they began as hay burners back in the 1870s when they were introduced to Jacksonville, drawn by horses or mules.
Well, when I got here, the streetcars were down Main Street with palm trees on both sides, and it wound up at the Archridge Farm, which is beyond the Evergreen Cemetery, and the other line went to Ortega. And for a nickel, you could ride on the streetcar. And the first one I remember was horse-drawn, but that was changed just about the time we got here to electric cars.
If there was a bad storm or something like that, then the arm that went up to reach the wires, if it went down, you stayed put where you were. My mother and I were shopping downtown, going toward town to shop, and the electrical storm or the arm went down, whatever happened, I don't remember, that's a good while back, and the trolley stopped, and as power had gone off from it. So we had to sit there and wait until the repairman came out and got the arm up to the line again to go on to town and finish our expedition of the day. I was very small then, so I don't remember how long we were there. It was all exciting to me. It wasn't to my mother.
I remember going on the streetcar like on Sunday. That was the day we went to Ortega. They had a playground there. You could buy drinks and food and things like that. We went there for a picnic for the whole day. And that was one of the occasions I always remembered.
I used to ride the streetcar home after I got married. I'd ride the streetcar home for lunch. It was cheaper to ride the streetcar for a nickel than it was to buy a 10-cent hamburger downtown. And remember one time going out to see a cousin of mine lived out on Gilmore Street, and I missed where I was supposed to get off. I wasn't but about 10 years old. And I rode all the way to the end of the Article line. Didn't recognize it. And had to tell the conductor what happened. He let me off at the right spot on the return trip. Well, that was a long ride.
Most were closed in, but there were the open-air kind, too. And when we were kids, riding on them was loads and loads of fun.
Of course, I remember one thing about them was Halloween, when all the boys in the neighborhood, and most of them were bigger than me, but they'd gather at Brown's Drugstore at 4th and Main and soap all his windows, and then they proceeded to soap the streetcar tracks. And the streetcar would pull up there, stop, let off somebody. Then it couldn't get started again. The wheels would just spin, spin, and spin. And we thought we were having great fun.
Well, I can remember kids on Halloween had a bad habit of picking on streetcars. And once when I went home, they not only greased the track, the kids, one of them ran out from behind the bushes and pulled the trolley off the wire. And by the time I got off at where I had gotten off, I was about 3 blocks past there, because that streetcar just floated just like it was on water because they greased the track so much.
Well, when we were young kids, as they would do, we put a penny on the tracks, and when a streetcar would run over it, well, I'd squeeze it down to a very thin sliver, and we thought that was fun.
Oh, this is terrible. I shouldn't tell this. I was tutored in the summer out by the Disciples of Christ Church on Riverside Avenue. It wasn't there, but it was near there. And I rode the streetcar home, and a man flashed me in the streetcar. And I was just a kid. I mean, I was about 10 years old, and I was scared to death. And I was scared to tell my parents.
To me, they would be a great thing to have today. Surface transportation, I believe in it.
The trolleys connected with the ferries, and one of the busiest intersections was at Main and Bay Streets, where you could catch a ferry to South Jacksonville or to the beaches. Our railroads and the old Union Terminal were part of the scene before most of us were born. But there are still those of us who remember.
One of my favorite places is the Jacksonville Terminal, a place where I spent many hours because my husband worked in the baggage and mail department. At one time, he was superintendent of baggage and mail department. And there we would go and wait for our friends who came on other trains outside of Jacksonville.
My traveling days, I really enjoyed and went in and out of Jacksonville's Union Station literally hundreds of times. So to me, it was a welcome sight.
Union Station, well, I was a little bit older then because I remember more about that when I was going to college and during the war. But that's where you met everybody, meeting everybody. And the trains were seldom on time, but they came right into the station. And no matter where you went, you only had to walk 2 or 3 tracks to get them. And then they'd go on out from there. Even over the bridge to the south side, they went over the trestle right from there.
I came in May of 1912 at the old Union Station. I remember coming through there about noon. The structure, the arc is still there on Bay Street. And when they tore it down and put up the new Prime Osborne Center, that remained.
My happiest recollection of the old terminal was the day that we all, the Navy wives and the Marine wives and so forth, all went down to the terminal because we had been given the word that our men were coming back. They were coming back from World War II. And many of them had been, like my husband, had been in the Pacific for over 3 years. We hadn't seen them in 3 years. And so I came up and was at the Union, the old terminal, waiting with all these other wives, and you never heard so much squealing and shouting and a great deal of sobbing and crying that went on too, because we were all so thrilled that they were home safe and sound, you know.
We enjoyed our playing in those big benches. Had great big, it was just like the typical Union Station that you see in the movies now of olden days. But it was a beautiful place.
My memories of it are of the echoes inside when they announce the trains. They just reverberate back and forth. It's a very echo-filled place.
That's something else y'all don't see anymore. The little glass things filled with little candy bits. You know, you get a little glass gun, a little glass boat, and you could take the top off of it, pour those things out, and that was the only place you could get them was a train station that I can remember.
Union Station was always a big event for me to go down there. My father worked for the railroad, so we went quite often. We traveled up to his home office up in Virginia, and we'd go travel on the train, and it was just a big excursion to go like that. I enjoyed it. We'd go down there for meals at the restaurant in there and go early so that we could relax before we got on the train, and then we'd see all these trains come in and go down into the, oh, what did you call it? Anyway, the underground that came up to the tracks way out away from the terminal. But it was always so big to me as a child, so wonderful. I hated to see it closed. I don't remember when it closed. I just remember it did when Amtrak and all opened.
Through all of this, our own Big Jim, the municipal whistle you can hear for miles around, has been keeping us in step with the times. Morning, noon, and night, blowing away since 1884, more than 100 years.
You used to ask around here, who is Big Jim? People would say, well, he's Alabama governor. He used to go around kissing people, kissing babies. But that's not true. Big Jim is a 32-inch high whistle that's on top of the Southside generator plant now, and it was moved there in 1966. But originally, it was down at the First and Main Waterworks, and I believe it was opened there in 1890, somewhere about 1890, by Mr. John E-I-N-E-I-G, Enig, I believe. I believe that's the correct pronunciation. And he was a man that brought the first automobile to Jacksonville, too. And according to the records, it was named after a friend of his, either brother-in-law, Jim Patterson. That's where they got the name Big Jim.
Big Jim was a time to get up, to come home, to eat, and get ready for bed, because it was the noise that you heard all over town. It woke you up at 7 o'clock in the morning. At noon, 12 o'clock, people came home for lunch. At 1 o'clock, they went back to work, and at 5 o'clock, they came home again. And that was Big Jim.
There are legends of buried treasure in Moncrief Creek, dating back to the earliest time, legends about our treaty oak tree and how it got that name from a peace pact made with Indians under that tree in the days of yore. Closer to our own yesterdays, there are legends from the gangster era of the 1930s of an estate on the St. Johns River off Atlantic Boulevard where Al Capone is said to have lived for a spell. Another famous house is still standing in Jacksonville today, is said to have been home of one of the most infamous gunmen of the gangster era. And people still talk about him. To find out who he was, you're just going to have to stay tuned.
I was brought up and lived for many years in the backwoods of Ortega, and I delivered papers during the last 3 years of my high school days, out on the point of Ortega. And there was this particular house that looked sort of like a castle maybe, or had a big wall around it, that they said later on that Machine Gun Kelly had been in. Now that was always somewhat of a question, but they said that he had been there. Now, I delivered papers, I'm pretty sure, during that period of time. So it was sort of a mystery at the time. Later on, it came out by the FBI, I believe it was, had raided the place during the night, and apparently Machine Gun Kelly had left, but they did apparently find a large catch of arms there, guns and so forth.
Now that gangster house, it's a mystery to this day. It was either Machine Gun Kelly, Al Capone, or Dutch Schultz. I'll never know, and I don't think anybody else will.
There are things in our yesterdays that many remember fondly, which are no longer here with us today. We still have Hemming Park in the heart of Jacksonville, but the hotels that bordered it only yesterday, the St. James Hotel and the Windsor, are gone now. And all that remains of them are memories.
Going way back, there was a big wooden hotel over there where Penny's is now, next to Goins, and it was called the Windsor Hotel. And it was a beautiful, people came from up north down here for the winter, you know, and stayed there, and they didn't have many single rooms, but mostly suites. And have dances there. They had a, oh Lordy mercy, they had a fountain in there, and everything. One lady got a little tipsy one night and fell in the fountain.
I used to work in the Florida Baptist building back on Church Street, and we had a back drafting room where the draftsman would knock off work when some gal in the Windsor Hotel would get up about 10 a.m. and get dressed without closing her shades. And we'd lose more work time that way than the law allowed.
The George Washington, the Seminole, the Mayflower, the Mason, and a host of other old hotels once served as civic centers, and their nightclubs and restaurants were popular gathering places. You remember them, don't you? Only yesterday.
When my baby girl was born, my husband and I went down to the Calling Hotel, and the man that wrote My Blue Heaven was there. What was his name? Gene Austin. And he played for me. My husband asked him to play a song for me, and he did. And it turned out to be that same little old My Blue Heaven that everybody knows. But that was fun.
The George Washington Hotel was the first hotel that we had in Jacksonville that had a ballroom on the top floor, you know, up in the, well, I guess it was at the very top of the building, and they used to call it the ballroom in the sky. And I remember that the waiters all wore white gloves, and we were very impressed. We thought this was very super because the waiters wore white gloves to serve the tables with.
So George Washington was my downfall. Two friends of my brothers asked my best friend and myself for a date, and so we went to the football game out at the Gator Bowl. And we came back and they said, let's go have dinner at the George Washington. Well, my friend and I said, oh, well, of course, you know, we're real uptown. And so we went, and I couldn't think, I got so nervous, I couldn't think of a thing to order to eat but shad fish. And shad fish is nothing but one bone after another. And I thought, Lord, mostly what am I going to do with this? So then I said, well, I got to go to the ladies' room. And I said to my friend, come on, let's go. She says, no, I don't have to go. I could have killed her. So I went and walked that. They had the dinner that night because of so many people in town. They'd opened up the ballroom and set up dinner tables. And I had to walk the whole length of that ballroom to get to the ladies' room. And I got there, and it cost a dime. And I didn't have a dime. So I had to borrow a dime from the maid. So the next day, I took the dime back to her.
All of the hotels were just beautiful. They had dances and teas, and it was just really nice.
Entertainers like Billy Daniel and Ray Charles launched their careers at downtown clubs. Judy Canova, Dorothy Shay, and Wanda Hendricks were among the famous and near famous who came from Jacksonville or entertained here only yesterday.
Dorothy Shay was my first girlfriend, and when I was in the 6th grade at Fishweir and was captain of schoolboy patrol, Dorothy, she was Sims then, was a real cute gal in the 5th grade, and I wound up giving her a ring I'd bought at Cress's jewelry, Cress's 5 and 10 cent store downtown, which she, about 6 months later, returned it to me and said she picked somebody else rather than me. So I threw the ring in the Fishweir Creek, and the kids who were around there went up and told my father about it, and he never let up on it the rest of my life, on my first romance.
I remember Dorothy Shay when I was in the 1st grade at Fishweir School in Jacksonville, and she lived just about a block away from where I lived, and I would go by and we would walk to school together. And then I left Jacksonville, came to the beach, and I didn't see her except occasionally. But I knew I just was very fond of her and admired her very much because she had a positive attitude toward life and what she was going to be when she grew up. And it turned out that that's what she did. And she was a singer, and she was known as the Park Avenue Hillbilly in New York.
Dorothy Shay lived on Herschel Street, across the street from my mother and father, with whom I lived at the time. And she was a real nice girl. She was the older sister of the boy I went with. And we were just in junior high and high school, you know. And she was so nice, and she could sing.
I know that there was a park next door to where I lived, and she would come over in the afternoons, and we would play house by raking up the pine straw and making rooms where you could go in and out like we were going to be architects when we grew up. But I also remember getting caught in the quicksand there, and she pulled me out. She saved my life, but I didn't know it, and she didn't know it either.
Wanda Hendricks was a very charming and a very talented young lady, and she started, well, she played a role at the Jacksonville Theater. It's called Theater Jacksonville, but used to be called Jacksonville Little Theater. And she was cast in this ingenue role in one of the plays, and she had such outstanding talent that I remember saying to the director, Paul Geisenhoff, I said, I believe that girl is going to go places. I think we should watch and see what happens with her. And Paul was very much impressed with her too. And he worked with her very hard and very closely. And I think that in a way, I won't say that she got her start through the Jacksonville Little Theater, but I do think she was encouraged, very encouraged in her career by what happened to her through the theater.
Well, Wanda Hendricks and I attended Kirby Smith's Junior High School in Jacksonville, seemed like 100 years ago, in the early 40s. I never did spend too much time with Wanda other than from class to class, but during our time we were invited to a birthday party. And we went to this party.